Although you'd never be able to tell it nowadays, Clark Street in the town of Grantsville follows the same route taken by the Donner Party, the Hastings Cutoff of 1846. And actually, this is very significant because one of the first deaths on the trail of disease happened in this town. They spent 2 days here in Grantsville, and at the site of the street where the old cutoff would have run through is the old Donna Reed Museum, and you need to make an appointment with one of the volunteers to actually view it, and I've done that, so let's go inside.
They had some historians that did an extensive look into trying to find Hargraves and Halloran's burial site, and they even used ground penetrating radar, and they checked the site, a couple of sites over in Lake Point, to see likely places they'd been told they might be, and they didn't find anything. Makes a pretty monument.
And Luke Halloran, you were saying, he was buried next to somebody else.
Next to Hargrave.
And he was a Grand Mason.
Well, he was a Mason. I think he was a master. And they reported he was buried with some of his symbols.
So I was looking up some of the quotes, and it said as you dug down, it was almost pure salt, at least from one of the quotes I saw.
Yeah. There's different quotes. It was quite sandy. Now, the best recollection is in the Linghard Journal, and that's who Hastings was traveling with, and they came here about 3 days after the Harlan Young party was here, and Linghard wrote in his journal that as they came into camp, they had just buried or getting ready to bury the fellow that had died in their party, and that would be Hargrave, just west of the creek bed by which they were camped, which would be just west of us, because the North Willow Creek come right down through about the east side of what is our cemetery today, and then on down through here to the north.
Luke Halloran was one of the first deaths associated with the Donner Party, and he died of consumption on August 25th of 1846. And he was buried somewhere right alongside the Hastings Cutoff Trail, just south around the town of 25 Wells, or rather the area known as 25 Wells. Nobody was living here, but there were a lot of brackish wells in the area. So they stayed here for a few days, and it said that they buried him with a number of Masonic symbols because he made it well known that he was a master Mason and he wanted to be buried like this. And they buried him right alongside somebody else who had died of a similar disease from a wagon train that was only a few days before them. Now, we don't know where they're buried, and they've searched for their graves for years, but the road that runs behind me, and you can take a look and see the historical farm sign there, that is the road that would have actually been the Hastings Cutoff, and it would have went clear through to Nevada, but the entire town has been built right along this road. And if they were only 3 days behind that advanced party, what happened to them? Did they make it through the harsh winter?
Oh yeah, there was actually 4 parties that crossed that year on the Hastings Trail. One of the best books for the journey is called What I Saw in California by Edwin Bryant. And the first group to come through was the Bryant Russell party. And they had sold and got rid of their wagons in Wyoming and were just on horseback with pack animals.
So you could make it through a lot faster.
And they were traveling faster. It had its own challenges. But he kept a daily journal, and what's so good about it is he published it in 1848, so it's not colored by time or memory. Now, I don't believe by reading his journals that they camped here at the wells. I believe they camped several miles south of us on what today's North Willow Creek. And they didn't go out around the mountains because they were on horseback. They just went up and over.
So they didn't follow the same route as the Donners to the springs?
Not necessarily. They hit a lot of the water holes, but they could take a more direct route. Another interesting thing is because it was just 12 men on horseback, they had a lot of contact with the Indians. And the Indians, for some reason, didn't associate or go near the large wagon trains. They were just apprehensive about it.
And I was going to ask, so Skull Valley, I know a lot of go shoot there. Mm-hmm. When was the first time that the Indians began attacking the Donner Party? Was it around here?
No, that was not clear until they were in central Nevada, and that was Paiutes.
So the natives here would have been more peaceful. Were these some of the first whites they saw?
Yes, probably. Depends on what you call white. They had a lot of interaction with Mexicans and Comancheros. There's a great story of an old Indian up in the Grouse Creek country. And he said that he told him when he was a young boy, first time he seen white men, it scared him so bad he hid for 3 days. And it was probably the Bidwell Bartleson party that went across north of the lake in 1841.
So they watered on the Bear River and they headed west, and the one story that I read, they were worried about water. They were running low on water, and they could see a mirage. So they headed for the mirage, and they got their wagon stuck. As they were digging out, they realized they were digging in sand, or salt, not sand. So they were headed right into the Salt Lake. They dug themselves out. They had to go back to the Bear River, get water, and then they came up along the other side of the mountain, followed along the edge of the lake, and then went on the other side of the mountain. They missed every watering hole, and it's horrible out there. We went on a tour a couple of years ago with, I can't remember his name, Terry. Anyway, he really knows a lot about this party. They were called the Bidwell Bartleson Party. Anyway, there were 30 of them that decided to go to California. The other 30 decided to be safe and go back to, or keep on going to Oregon. So these 30 people, anyway, they came out through there, and it's horrible. There's salt marshes and salt grass. There's not good feed for animals. There's not good water. It was awful. But they eventually made it to California. One of the men went back to get his family, and we believe that he came through here on his way back east.
That they had to manually bring the wagons down the riverbed and lead the livestock up and around.
So did they pass just north of Ogden, or did they go past Donna?
Just south of Ogden.
Near Immigrant Summit.
Yeah, and then at the mouth of the canyon, they called it the Devil's Gate, and they had to build a derrick and lower the wagons down through the ledges.
It sounds like their decision to buy the most expensive wagons might have hurt them.
Well, that was definitely the whole trip. Not just the most expensive, they're heavily laden. James Reed was wealthy, and his intent was to set up a mercantile store in California. So he had at least one wagon heavily loaded with trade goods. You can see where they came into Utah right here from Evanston. They come down Echo, and then the flattest way through the Wasatch is down the Weber and comes out just south of Ogden. But it's also got those narrow choke points. Now that wouldn't be a major route through the Wasatch until '69, and the railroad would use it. But they blasted 3 tunnels. Now the Donner Party built from about Hennifer up the East Canyon, and then over Big Mountain, and then Billy's Mountain, and then down Immigration. Now another interesting thing, when Linghard came out of the Weber, just to the mouth of the canyon, he wrote in his journal that it's beautiful, farmable, arable ground. It looks wonderful. If there's any kind of settlement here, I'd stay. This would be far enough. He didn't know just 6 miles north was Fort Buenaventura in what today's Ogden. Had been there for a few years.
And Fort Buenaventura was used by
Miles Goodyear, an old trapper, had a trading post there. A little settlement, had been farming and well established. He had come in the early, mid-spring of '46 from Oregon with a pack train of animals and supplies. And he went that way.
Wasn't there some kind of advance warning? One of the mountain men said, don't go on Hastings Cutoff or something?
Well, yeah, there was several of those. There was a guy named James Kleiman, who was another old mountain man that had been with Hastings 100, or Ashley's 100. And he was on his way east with a group of people, some businessmen, some people had been in California just heading home. It's 20 or 30 people, and he was guiding them back east. And he's the one that carried the letter from Hastings encouraging people and informing them of this cutoff. And it basically said he would meet them at Fort Bridger and guide them through. And Kleiman took that letter, and when he met up with the Donner Party, He and James Reed were old friends. They had served together in the Army during the Black Hawk War in Illinois under Jubal Early, along with another fellow that would excuse me, make his mark in history, Abe Lincoln. They were all good friends. And he took Reed aside and told him, don't take this route. I just come over most of it. It's virtually impassable for a wagon. Stick to the main route, push hard, and you might get through. But for a lot of reasons, Reed had made the decision to take this route. And so they came. And the other case was Edwin Bryant was in the lead on horseback, and he sent a letter back to Tamsen Donner because he knew her. And in the letter he wrote, don't come down this route. When you hit Fort Bridger, make your way north to Soda Springs. Take the normal route. Don't do it. Well, that letter was never delivered. They are pretty certain that either Bridger or his partner Vasquez took the letter and destroyed it, because they had a vested interest in the wagon trains coming through Fort Bridger.
Because they wanted to establish the Republic of California.
Well, Bridger and Vasquez wanted to promote their Fort Bridger. Seeing that? Before that, that was just a little west of the main route, so they weren't getting much business from it, if any. But the parties that came through there refitted. The Donner Party got a lot of new oxen and refreshed their livestock in that. So it was a very big financial gain for them to have the route go through there.
In 1827, Jedediah Smith was the first white man who was confirmed to have made a journey from California through Nevada, through northern Utah, and then onwards towards the east. And he remarked at Tempe Point that to the north and east before him stretched a great expanse of water, and that he could hardly believe that he was the first white man to view the Great Salt Lake. But we found out later that it's Stansbury Island. There is a petroglyph which reads 1820, a full 7 years before Jedediah Smith ever passed through the region. And right over here we have the entrance to Skull Valley, which is where the immigrants would have taken the Hastings Cutoff. And coming over from this direction behind us now, the Donner Party would have spent several days burying one of their members at 20 Wells, which is now Grantsville, moving up along the edge of this valley, and then going down Skull Valley, where they would continue over the Hastings Cutoff. But what they discovered was that springs like the one behind me were no longer good for their cattle. As I'm looking straight ahead right now, I can see 80-foot tall mounds of just pure salt. Because this area is so salty, it's at the southern edge of the Great Salt Lake, it's an inexhaustible supply for the Morton Company. And this spring would have given them just enough to keep them going, but their cattle began to lose their minds and run off into the desert. And this would be a first stopping route as they went down south towards what is now Yosepa and then over the pass.
Several different versions, but the one I have the most stock in is from the personal writings of Hiram Sevier, who was the first child born in what today's Grantsville. Lived most of his life in Skull Valley. And it's in some of the early journals of the first settlers that when they went out into the next valley, the water holes in the north end had human bones and skulls around them. And the natural assumption of them and the parties earlier was that the water's poison. So they passed by those springs till they got further south where there's many more springs. And when they made peace with the Indians a few years later, they inquired, why the skulls and bones? The water's not poison. And the Goshute Indians in the area told them that about 20 years prior, the bad Indians, which would have been probably Utes and Comanchero Mexicans, came in from the south, killed a lot of the men and took a lot of women and children for slaves. Not an uncommon thing. The ones that survived and escaped went out in the desert to a place called Wig Mountain, and stayed, and they said they came in and put the bones of the dead around the water holes to ward off the bad Indians. And it's still called Skull Valley. We believe that you've seen the family palace car. James Reed built that for his mother-in-law to travel in comfort. He was a furniture maker, cabinet maker, and that by trade, so he's very handy with wood. But you can see it was quite a bit larger than a standard wagon. It had a cook stove and berths, and it's even reported by one account that it had a small organ in it. So it was traveling in style, taking a Winnebago.
Did it make it?
No, it's right here. Part of it.
That would be now in Dugway, the bombing range.
No, it'd be on the Eagle Range. But so anyway, it took extra oxen, 2 and 3 teams to pull it, and was tended to slow them down. We believe it was abandoned on the desert, and the stuff on this display, most of it is from that exact wagon. One of the things that believes that goes to that is that hub down there is from the desert, from a Donner wagon, a standard wagon. This hub is a lot bigger. And you see the size of the axle over here? They couldn't bring in, and this is in the late 20s, they couldn't bring in the whole axle, so they cut the end of it off. You can see the construction of the basket spindle. And it doesn't have an axle nut, it just has a pin that held the wheel on. And it's good sized. That's a big heavy axle. These are oxen shoes. A lot of people didn't know their oxen were shod. Found probably where the oxen wearing them died. Some china that was real fine china in the day. A lot of stuff is stuff that wealthy people would have. A lot of people have never even heard of this little crucible that was found at the site. That's natural amber.
Oh, they would have used that for?
Ancient tree sap. And you'd put your prepared food in an earthen container, put a wooden lid on it, heat that on a stove or a fire, and that would melt even today. And they would pour that around the lid to seal it. They hadn't invented paraffin wax yet. And pretty much only wealthy people had prepared food like that.
And if this is on the Eagle Range, is the military doing anything to kind of protect the site now?
There's not much left. The last expedition to go out was in 1984, before they flooded that part of it with pumps that they put out to control flooding on the lake. And they reported when they went out that there was so little left in the mounds that they could barely identify it. You can see this picture here was taken in the late 20s, looking west, and anything that was left out there created a dune. And when they hit the flats, they call it salt flats, but they're on mud flats. It has a crust of alkali salt on it that glistens like salt, but it's only a thin crust, and you break through that, there's just bottomless mud.
And if the Donner Party had any pretenses that their journey was going to get easier, it probably would have died along with almost half of their cattle out here on the Bonneville Salt Flats. It's just pure salt and kind of moist right now, you know, showing all of the water that is underneath it. And it just tastes like salt. But, you know, going over it, it feels like hardcore sandpaper. This is basically cement, at least in this part, but once you crack through this layer, hundreds and hundreds of feet of basically quicksand. And this is where I truly believe that Lansford Hastings was something of an evil man. He looked at a map and he saw, hey, there's a huge flat area, why not go over that? It'll cut 100 miles off the journey. In reality, it was a huge expanse of salt desert, and it added hundreds of miles onto the journey. On top of that, this area nowadays is very well taken care of, because they've cut ditches around the outside of it and lowered the water level. Back in the time of the Donner Party, it would have been a crust of salt about that thick. Beneath that is endless mud. So just after burying one of their first members to die of disease, they come up and they come here, which they were assured would be an easy couple-day push before you get to the springs and the welcoming valleys of Nevada.
And they found that the standard way of wagons, one behind the other, was totally impractical because each wagon would go deeper in the mud and a fourth or fifth wagon would be stuck. So they had to fan out and you know, go several abreast and work their way across. And that's why you see the mounds are scattered out where the wagons were left.
Are there any journal accounts explaining that they lost a large wagon, or
well, there's different accounts, yes. Some say they abandoned 5 wagons, others say they abandoned 7. Now, there's also another account. A lot of people base it on, one of the deals on Virginia Reed's account that she wrote many, it was like 15 or 20 years after the fact, that they left the family's wagon in the desert. Or no, that they left the wagons and all they had was the family wagon when they come out. Well, the thing that I say blows that out, they had a wagon for the family. But she also said it was being pulled by an oxen and a milk cow. Now, there's no way you pulled that wagon with 1 ox and a milk cow through the mud. We believe that they abandoned that wagon and took one of the lighter wagons they had, of which they had several, and that's what they carried, what they could carry on to the springs, because they had lost nearly all their livestock. He was able to purchase another oxen or 2 from other people that had more of them, but it was devastating to James Reed. And then there's an account from 1847 of some members of the Mormon Battalion on their way back from California that used that route in the fall of 47 to come to Salt Lake. And they said they got caught in a really horrific storm out on the flats, and they happened upon, and as they wrote, an unusually large wagon that was cached full of supplies. They were in sore need of the supplies, and they burned a lot of the wagon to weather the storm. And that's from 47. And then the next report we have of wagons is from the survey that Captain Stansbury did in 1850. And he reported seeing some wagons, as many as 7, abandoned out on the desert flats. An axle and a bolster that's from a light wagon. And this is a wheel hub. And you can date it because it's got a notch cut in it. Because in the 1840s, they would have a pin that held the wheel on, and you had to be able to knock that pin out. Later on, they would use an axle nut, so you didn't need that notch.
So they didn't make it very far on the cutoff.
Well, they did pretty good. No one died out there. Here's a good map that shows the route they took. They would camp here at the wells for 3 days. And that's what this area was called, as 20 wells. That's why we're the 20 wells chapter, the Sons of Utah Pioneers. And they would camp here for 3 days and rest their livestock. And then they'd go out around the north end of what today's the Stansberries, down as far as Good Hope Springs. And that's where the Donner Party found the note that Hastings had left them, that the birds had pecked it apart. And they put it together enough to read, it said 2 days, 2 nights, 40 miles, hard drive, next good water. Well, it's closer to 80. Some metal parts that are from the ox yokes and the team equipment that were left. And then here, we've got 2 rifle barrels and stocks that were found out at the sites.
And these could have been from the Donner Party?
Pretty much. Pretty certain they were Donner Party items.
How many people visit this museum?
Well, we've got a book. We have probably a few thousand a year.
It doesn't seem like it. It seems like you should get more. It's very interesting.
Well, it's kind of off the way. A lot of people aren't that interested in history anymore.
Sadly.
And then there's a knife. It was probably a greener by its design, common utility knife. And then the one behind it is a large hand-forged blade, probably some sort of butcher knife. And then we're going to try and improve the lighting, but you can see there's a pick and an axe head and some other items there that come from the sites. And then my favorite story is this little table right here. 1929, Charles Kelly and a couple of guys named Durfee from Grantsville and an Orr from Skull Valley drove a Model A out on the flats and found a wagon from the Donner Party, documented it, studied it, did the archaeological thing, and when they went to leave, the Model A was stuck in the mud. And so to get out, they tore some of the wagon apart, used the planks to get the Model A out. Now the story was they threw the planks on the top in case they got stuck again. And one of the fellows, probably a Durfee from Grantsville, made some furniture out of it. Now the legs are an old cedar tree root that you go out and pull up out here in the desert sand. And they would do that and make furniture out of them. But this is a piece probably of the floor of a Donner wagon. That's old growth oak.